Sorry, the choir was a little late. Misty hadn't learned to listen to the director yet, so we're working on her to train her. Number 514 is When We All Get to Heaven. Would you join us? We're going to sing all four stanzas. Let's sing and stand and sing and worship. Would you join us? Join us now as we welcome each other in our fellowship time.
might be 50-year-old, but she quick.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you're making your way back to our Bibles to Judges chapter 4. We'll be in Judges chapter 4 as we are continuing in our study of the of 10 of the extraordinary women of the Bible. Tonight we're looking at Deborah, and we're going to follow the same sort of pattern, the same sort of process. We're going to look at her biography, her life and death, and even the lessons learned from her, from what we learn about in the scriptures. And so for us to get started tonight, we're going to read I'm going to read Judges chapter 4 for us, and this will tell us a little bit about Deborah and give us sort of some background of what we know from Scripture about her before we start into looking at her biography. So let's start off in Judges chapter 4 and verse 1. It says, "After Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Yavin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Cicero, who lived in Hareshoth Hagoyim, because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried to the Lord for help. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, 'The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Yavin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands.' Barak said to her, 'If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go.' 'Very well,' Deborah said, 'I will go with you, but because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman.' So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree of Zananim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered together his 900 iron chariots and all the men with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, 'Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?' So Barak went down Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim. All the troops of Sisera fell by the sword, not a man was left. Sisera, however, fled on foot to the tent of Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because they were friendly relations between Yavin, king of Hazor, and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Yael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, 'Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid.' So he entered her tent, and she put a covering over him. 'I'm thirsty,' he said, 'please give me some water.' She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. 'Stand in the doorway of the tent,' he told her. 'If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone here, say no.' But Yael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Yael went out to meet him. 'Come,' she said, 'I will show you the man you're looking for.' So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Yavin, the Canaanite king, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites grew stronger and stronger against Yavin, the Canaanite king, until they destroyed him." So that is a whole lot of Hebrew words that are very difficult to say, and next time I will pick a chapter with a whole lot less of those to read aloud in church. But nevertheless, that is an awesome story when you read it from the perspective that we're looking at with Deborah, and how she was just this extraordinary woman that we find in the pages of Scripture. And so we learn a lot about her from a biographical sense in what we read there in chapter 4. And so we do know that her name is Deborah. The name Deborah means bees, as in the stinging things that make honey. And there's some debate about as to whether her and her husband were beekeepers or something along that line, or that her warrior type attitude and the things that she did to help lead Israel as a judge was like a bee or a hornet in the side of, or into the Canaanites. And so not exactly sure what that means as far as that goes, but we know that she was born somewhere in the 1100s. To put it in perspective, this is 1,000 years after Sarah that we looked at last week. So it's been a millennia since Abraham and Sarah lived to the time of Deborah. We know that she was born in Israel, possibly somewhere around the tribal lands of Benjamin and Ephraim, which are sort of just around the area of Jerusalem in southern Israel, southern to middle of Israel. We know that she died sometime in the 1100s because there are some traditions that place her death at about 75 years. There's one that says she was born in 1200 and died in 1126, and so we're not sure. She lived less than 100 years, probably around 75. We know that she is that when she died, her death was in Israel, and she was actually buried in the north of Israel, in the tribal land of Naphtali, near a place called Tel Kadesh, which is Kadesh that we know of from the story that we just read. It's about 3/4 of a mile south of the Lebanese border, which is kind of interesting if you ever look at that sort of thing. And it's a place, I'll show you in just a second, a picture of her tomb, because you can go visit it today. But we know that her profession was that she was a judge and a prophetess. And the interesting thing is the only other person in the Bible to serve as a judge and a prophet was who? For the Daily Double, who was the only other person who would have served as a prophet and a judge? The answer is Samuel. So, Samuel and Deborah are in rare company, the two of them. And so we know that the first mention of her also is in Judges 4:4. Now, if that right there is a picture of the tomb of Deborah, it's on a mountain in the northern reaches of Israel. The interesting thing is that is a Roman age sepulcher, but there are that has been traditionally the spot where Deborah was buried 3,000 years ago. So it's pretty cool, something that you can, if you're ever in northern Israel, you can go and check that out. But Daryl, do I have a map after that, or do what? Is a couple down? Okay. Okay, and so you see there at the north end of Israel, right there up in this region. Jerusalem's way down here, but modern-day Lebanon runs basically right through here. But that's where she was buried, in the town Kadesh, where Barak was from. And so what we see next that we're going to talk about is Deborah's life and her death. And so we know really nothing from the pages of Scripture about Deborah's life until we get to Judges 4 and 5. That's where we really find the bulk of what we know about her. I mean, basically everything that we know about her. We know that from the biblical accounts and the way that the calendar ran and things, that this is about 200 years after the days of Joshua, when they conquered all of Israel and took their, tried to take over from the Canaanites. And so it's been about 200 years since the death of Joshua. And during that time, the Israelites slowly fell into this roller coaster relationship with God. They did the same thing over and over and over for generations, for hundreds of years. What they would do is Israel would fall away from God, and then God would turn them over because of their sin to some outside enemy, the Philistines, the Canaanites, whoever. And they would oppress them for 10, 20, 40 years, whatever it may be. And then the people would get tired of it. They would call out to God, and God would send them a judge to deliver them, because God hears their prayers. And then they would be delivered. There would be peace in the land. They would follow God for a little while. Then they would fall off the wagon again, and they would start following the Canaanite gods. They'd run away from God, and the cycle would start all over again. And what we know is from what we read in Judges 1 through 3, we see that there are already 3 judges that have served God in Israel. You have Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. All 3 of those judged Israel before Deborah came on the scene. And as for Deborah, as far as her growing up, her marrying, in this chaotic spiritual climate and culture that she found in Israel at that time, we don't know anything about her before she steps on the scene as a judge and starts telling Barak what to do. And so we know that she probably experienced some of the peace that occurred in Israel after Ehud was the judge, and things sort of leveled out there for a little while. Now, the interesting thing, to connect this to world history, Bible scholars connect this time of peace after the judge Ehud, from him, that time of peace, they connect that with the latter reign of Ramses II, the Pharaoh in Egypt. And he had a great influence over the Canaanite region during that time. And so they believe that the peace that was in Israel during that time was more easily sustained because of Pharaoh or Ramses's influence in Canaan. And so after Ramses died, it was sort of a free-for-all in Canaan. And what happened was many Canaanite kings sought to subjugate different parts of Israel and different tribes in Israel. And so the Israelites followed that normal spiritual pattern, that roller coaster we talked about, and they turned their backs on God. And what we see is that God handed them over to the Canaanite king Yavin, who ruled from a city that is now in northern Israel, a place called Hazor. And his army commander, as we read, was a man by the name of Cicero. And Cicero was like, the top dog. He was living high on the hog because they had 900 iron chariots, which was very far ahead of their time, so to speak. That was not something that many people had during that time. And not only that, they had plenty of soldiers, and they oppressed the Israelites for 20 years between after the end of the peace with Ehud to the time of Deborah. So there was, 20 years here that they were oppressing the Israelites. And as was true to the judges cycle that we see in the book of Judges, God raised up a judge, and this time raised up an extraordinary woman named Deborah. And we learn almost everything that we know about Deborah from verses 4 and 5 in chapter 4. I mean, we learn, basically everything we know. We know that she was married. Her husband's name was Lapidoth, and she lived and judged in the hill country of Ephraim between Ramah and Bethel. Bethel is the same place that Jacob had the dream, and Ramah is the same place that the prophet and judge Samuel will come from. And so she was from that region of Israel, sort of the central to southern section of Israel. But she is said to have sat under a palm tree to hold court, so to speak. And she would help to decide disputes and judge between the Israelites there from that palm tree. And so I think we've got that map again. You'll see there in the pictures there, or in the map there, you'll see a lot of different things, especially things that we've talked about already just because we've read the story. She's down here judging, down here in southern Israel. And Harosheth Hagoyim is the fortress for where Sisera had the 900 chariots and all the soldiers, and that's where he lived. The king Yavin lives up here in Hazor, and the Kishon River and Mount Tabor. Those are the two places involved in the battle. But then Kadesh, up here where Deborah is eventually buried, is where Barak lives, and he's the one that God is going to use or tries to use. As we saw, he's not exactly keen on going somewhere and doing what he's told when he's supposed to do it. And maybe he lacked a little confidence. We don't know what the issue was there, but Deborah may have just had that kind of charisma that he's like, look, I don't stand a chance without you being the one helping. And so he may have done that. And so, but when we look in the scriptures, we see that verse 6 takes a drastic turn where she's been sitting here judging between the Israelites and settling disputes and doing all of those things. when she goes from hearing those disputes to all of a sudden requesting for a man named Barak to come hear a message from the Lord that he had given to her to give to Barak. And so Barak was from Kadesh all the way up there in the northern reaches of Israel, from the tribe of Naphtali, and he was really, as we saw in the map, he's really not all that far from where Hazor is, where Yavin is ruling in Hazor. And so we read there that Deborah told him the message, said, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you." So this is not Deborah telling him to do this. This is the Lord using Deborah to repeat a message. And when someone has a message from the Lord and they repeat it, what do we call that in scriptural reference? She is being a prophet, right? Or prophetess. So she's being a prophet in this moment because she's saying that the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Cicero, the commander of Yavin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. And so God is telling him, this is what you need to do. You need to go up on Mount Tabor. I'm going to draw him to the Kishon River, and then I'm going to hand him in. You're basically it's a gimme. You're guaranteed to win. All you have to do is show up. I mean, think about that. How awesome is that in battle? Because that is never the case a lot of times when we see it. But here we see that Deborah is acting in that capacity as a prophetess, and she's giving this message to Barak from God, and it's a message that implies the future. So when we think about a prophet or a prophetess, that's exactly what they do. Now, Barak, as we know, was less than assured of himself, and so he told Deborah, he said, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." And so Deborah may have held that kind of position of just charisma, as I said a moment ago, or just that commanding respect position in Israel at this time. And he may have known that with her, the troops would be encouraged, they would be strengthened, they would be more willing to fight than for this guy from a backwater town in northern Israel saying, "Hey guys, let's go fight the people who have ruled over us for 20 years. And they've got iron chariots, and we get to walk out there on our feet and carry a sword, and we're probably going to get run over by horses." I mean, what kind of position did he find himself in? But if you have this woman who commands great respect, this woman who's acting as a judge, and this charismatic woman, then take her into battle with you, and he is feeling more assured of a victory. And so Deborah was willing to go with him. She was willing to go and be a part of the battle and do all the things that needed to be done. But since he didn't do what God had told him, wait a minute, what do we call it when we're disobedient to God? We call that sin, right? We've been talking about that on Sunday mornings a little bit. So when he was disobedient to what God told him to do, Deborah steps up and says that because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. And so for Barak to be this leader of 10,000 soldiers, and we've talked a few weeks ago about how the view of women in the pages of Scripture and how they were barely second-class citizens, and we talked about all of these things. This is a slap in the face to Barak for him to say, "Yes, I'll be the leader of the army," and Deborah's like, "Yeah, but since you didn't do what God told you to do, he's going to hand the glory to a woman." And for Barak, that was a slap in the face, as we see in the Scriptures. And so we see later how that plays out. So Deborah went with Barak, and they went to Kadesh. From where she was in the south, they went to the north, and they gathered the soldiers from Naphtali and from Zebulun, and there's 10,000 soldiers. And then they went up to Mount Tabor, and they went up there to await the battle. And so, we read this very linearly. We've talked about that before, about how there has to be gaps in time, but we read it as if, it's right next to next event going on. She asked for him to come from Kadesh, and he comes. Well, somebody had to go and get him and then bring him 70, 80 miles south to where she was at. Then they had to travel 70 or 80 miles back up to where he was at or from, gather the 10,000 troops, then march them all to Mount Tabor. And so all of this takes time, but it seems like to us that it's just bam, 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 right at one after the other. But as we know, it's not quite the case. So when Yavin's commander Cicero hears about this mass group of soldiers on Mount Tabor, he gathers his men, gets his 900 iron chariots, and they head for the Kishon River. And so it says that, or Darrell, go ahead and show us that. And so the Kishon River, it was a ways away from Mount Tabor, but there was flat land between the two where the battle would take place. And so as you see there, that the troops come down and they get to Mount Tabor. He brings his troops to the Kishon River, and then they get ready for this battle, and they get ready for what's going to go on. And Deborah told Barak, they're ready to go. They're ready for the battle to start. And she says, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" And so he takes the army from Mount Tabor, and he goes and attacks Sisera's army down near the Kishon River. And during this time, we see that it says in verses 15 and 16, it tells us about the victory over Sisera's forces. It says, "At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left." And so you see there that they're over here battling not far from the Kishon River, and Barak and his troops push them all the way back to their fortified city, basically. And so they get there, and what we see is that there's victory on the part of the Israelites, that Deborah leads Barak and these 10,000 soldiers to victory. And the interesting thing is that we're not going to, but if you flip over into Judges chapter 5, the very next chapter, it has a poem called the Song of Deborah. Now, that Song of Deborah is considered to be one of the oldest pieces of written Hebrew poetry in the world. And so that's pretty cool that this is the case with this. But in it, more specifically in verse 21, we read about how God delivered Sisera into Barak's hands. And what we read is, it says, "The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon. March on, my soul, be strong." And so, Darrell, if you can go back to there you go. And so what is believed to have happened is that Bible scholars believe that there was a rainstorm that comes in that ends up negating the tactical advantage of the chariots. Basically, they marred up. They got into the mud, and they lost the advantage that they had. What did it say Sisera did? He got down from his chariot and fled. Now, if your chariot is running real well, why are you getting down and running? If it's marred up in the mud, what are you going to do? You're going to get out and then try and get away. And that's what they think happened. They also think that this rainstorm, thunderstorm, whatever you want to call it, was so bad that the Kishon River even flooded and wiped away their staging area where the Canaanites had staged on the edge of the river, and that this flash flood with all the other rain washed them away. And so God used the rain along with the soldiers from Naphtali and Zebulun to defeat Sisera. And it's kind of interesting that that's how it is, and we find that from the Song of Deborah in chapter 5. And so after the battle, we read about this really weird ending to Sisera's life. In verses 17 through 22, we read how he leaves the battlefield on foot because the four-wheel drive on his chariot doesn't work, and so he's stuck in the mud, and he leaves and runs away. That's very heroic, isn't it? He's getting whipped by the Israelites, the people that they have subjugated for 20 years, and he's gotten beaten so badly that he has to just get out and run away. But that's what happens, and he comes to this camp of this man named Heber and Yael, and they are evidently friendly with the king of Canaan, in Hazor there, Yavin. So they evidently were supporters of his or friendly with him. And Sisera comes across their camp and tells Yael, says, "Let me hide in your tent." So he goes in and he hides, he pulls a blanket over him, and he asks for some water. And so she gives him milk, which is really like the weirdest thing ever. This dude is, how many of you going to give your kids a glass full of milk after they've been on the bounce house? Ain't a soul going to do it. Because that milk ain't staying where it went. And so here he is, he drinks this milk, And it's maybe it's like the whole, drink a little warm milk before you go to bed and it'll help put you to sleep type thing. I don't know. But he goes out like a light. He's exhausted. He's drank this milk, and he goes to sleep. And before he goes to sleep, he tells her, says, look, if anybody comes to the door and asks if there's anybody in here, tell them no. And she waits till he falls asleep and goes and gets a tent peg, takes it to his temple, and drives it through his head and puts him to I talked to somebody this week. They said, where is that in the Bible? I've never heard that story before in my life. That is amazing. And it's just like crazy, when you think about it. And so she takes that tent peg and nails him to the ground, and she is the woman that Deborah told Barak about that would gain the glory of defeating Cicero. And so that's what happens. As soon as Yael kills Sisera, she's wiping her hands off and walks to the door and, oh, hey, Barak, let me show you the guy you're looking for, and takes him into the tent and says, here he is. And there he is. I like the way, at least in my Bible, it was kind of funny in verse 20. It's not funny, but it's just interesting. In verse 22, it says, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, and it's got a dash and it says, dead. I'm like, what are you going to be otherwise if you've got a tent peg through your temple? I'm like, thank you for explaining that to me, And so, that's what happens. And so Israel fought after on this day and for a little bit longer. They fought and completely defeated Yavin, and Israel had peace for 40 years. A lot of times when you read in the Bible and it talks about 40 years, a lot of times what that's talking about is a generation, like a lifetime for a generation for some folks. And so that 40 years, that's something we see regularly, like in the book of Judges and in other places in the scriptures. But it's basically talking about a generation is the way that they look at that. So, when we think about this unusual and neat story about the story of Deborah, there are plenty of lessons that we can learn from her and her time as a judge in Israel. We learn about leadership. We learn about leading in a way contrary to who society says can lead or should lead. We learn about decisiveness. We learn about sticking to what you know to be true. We learn those lessons, but maybe the primary lesson that we should take away from examining Deborah's life is to be obedient to God no matter the situation. And I think that's what we really find in her story and in her life. Because when you consider the amount of information that we gain in just a short part of a chapter about her, we can't help but learn from her obedience to God. And now I want you to think about this. Consider these things. There's 4 things I want you to consider it, as part of her story. First off, God called her to be a judge and a prophet at a time when women did neither of these things. And she could have easily when God called her to be a judge and a prophet, she could have very easily have turned him down, lived a quiet, normal life with her husband, raising bees or whatever they were doing there in Ephraim. And she could have done that. But instead, she was obedient to God's calling on her life. And she stepped into this position filled only by one other person, Samuel. And so, think about that. That's pretty remarkable. Not only that, when God gave her the message to give to Barak about fighting against Yavin and Sisera, she could have considered those 900 iron chariots. She could have considered all of the soldiers that he had. She could have considered the fact that for 20 years, a part of her life, maybe even half of her life up to that time, had been ruled by the Canaanites. And so she could have taken all of that into consideration and decided against telling Barak the message that God had given to her. But instead, she was obedient to the message that God gave her and delivered it as he requested. Also, when Barak said, I will go, but only if you will go with me, she could have said no, and she could have stayed in Kadesh. She could have said no and went back to her palm tree in Ephraim and went down there. But rather than putting herself in harm's way close to the battlefield, that's what she could have done. But instead, she was obedient to the role that God gave her as a judge. And she used that position of influence. She used that position of that charismatic nature of hers, whatever it may have been, and she used that to help lead the armies of Zebulun and Naphtali. And help them win their battle. And think about this. When it began to rain and they're on the edge of the battlefield or maybe in the midst of the battle. You never know where they were at in this point. And when it started to rain, and God gave her the message to tell Barak to go and attack right now, that the Lord has given you Sisera. And she could have very easily have looked at the weather. She could have looked at the clouds, and she could have very easily looked at the situation around her and not relayed God's message. She could have been like, I think we'll wait till there's better light. We'll wait till it's dry. We'll wait till whatever. But instead, she was obedient not to rely on her own wisdom, which she would have been doing. Instead, she didn't rely on her own wisdom, but she relied on the wisdom of God and delivered the message. And we see the victory that came about because of that. And so when it comes to the things in life that God calls us to do, we have no valid excuse for being disobedient. We have no excuse. And so our obedience to God is what is needed each and every time God calls us to do something, to go somewhere, or to say something to someone. It's our responsibility. And each time we have the same options as Deborah. We have the exact same options that she had during her day. We can be obedient or we can be disobedient, one or the other. And we have to decide if we will be a man or woman of integrity and character like Deborah, or if we will be disobedient and choose our own path and choose our own will and choose our own wisdom as that guiding force in our life. And as we see from Deborah's life, obedience to God, no matter how difficult the situation, it will lead us to be successful in whatever he calls us to do. If we're obedient to him, we won't fail, because he won't call us to do something that would bring him glory and then allow us to fail. And so it's up to us to decide whether we're going to be obedient to what he's called us to do, or are we going to be disobedient and go our own way. And so I think from the life of Deborah, we can learn very quickly and very easily that following God and being obedient to him and what he's asked us to do will always lead us to victory, so to speak. And so that is our study for the night. And so we will pick up in a couple weeks on a new person. We will actually on September 11th, we will be looking at Ruth. And so we'll be looking at that extraordinary woman on that night. Now, for the next couple of Sunday nights, some different things will be going on. Next Sunday night, we will be having our end of summer fellowship, where we're asking you just to bring some sandwiches to share. They can be pimento cheese. They can be pimento cheese. They can be ham and cheese or whatever. But pimento cheese is a good kind to have. Peanut butter and jelly, all those sort of things. But bring some sandwiches to share, and we're going to have ice cream and have a time of fellowship. And so, want to end the summer and send the kids back to school in a good way. So next Sunday night we won't have our Bible study in here, and then the following Sunday night is Labor Day, and we won't have evening services because of the holiday. And so it'll be 2 more weeks until we're back in our study, and then that's when we'll look at Ruth. And so hope that you'll be here on Wednesday night as we are continuing in our study on encounters. We're going to look on Wednesday night at the demon-possessed man from Mark chapter 5. And so we're going to be looking at that. And then next Sunday morning, we will be wrapping up our time in the Romans Road, looking at Romans chapter 10. And so that's where we're headed in the next couple of times. And so with that being shared,